A long time ago it seemed that every game that wasn't about jumping on things was about fighting. There was a decent amount of shooting, but I seem to remember spending a lot of my younger years either beating up punks or beating up my punk brother, sometimes even in the same game. Mostly it was due to a console versus PC thing. My family only had consoles in the mid-90s, and in the 16-bit era fighting seemed to work better than shooting on a 2D plane. In a side-on game, guns don't make a lot of sense. Guns let you shoot great distances and attack enemies from afar, but unless you want to zoom out and make everything tiny, you can't really reflect that distance in 2D. But in fighters and at shorter ranges, the side-on camera allows you to see exactly where your character is in relation to enemies or obstacles. You can see all of the characters, even those to the sides and behind you, and can easily observe the distances between you. With that clear information, you can fight really well. You know the ranges of attacks based on easily readable visual clues, allowing you to form different strategies for different situations. You can judge things like when and how to close, to back off, to block, go aerial, or when to change targets. It's no surprise that even modern games that focus on melee fights still usually do it with a side-on or zoomed-out camera. But sometime after we picked up our first PC, my brother and I stopped playing those kinds of games and made the switch from fisticuffs to firefights. As time went on, I found that first-person and even over-the-shoulder cameras let me identify with the character more. So as newer side-on brawlers came out, I found myself avoiding them in favour of more immersive experiences. First person lets you see off into the infinite distance for those long-range headshots where shooter enemies often lurk, but it doesn't let you see your immediate surroundings very well. It makes melee fights problematic because close-by enemies are often outside of your field of view, and as they move around in your blind spots, tracking them becomes difficult. Unlike a side-on view, it's hard to keep an accurate mental model of where everyone is, reducing interesting strategic decisions and making players more reactionary. It's also more difficult to judge the distance between you and those enemies, for two reasons. One, unless you look straight down, you have no real sense of body presence, where your character's body actually is. And two, the false perspective of 3D images being displayed on a 2D screen. For example, it's easy in 2D to see that this pipe can hit me at this range, but much harder in first person to make a similar judgment. But some fighters found ways to make things work in first person or over the shoulder views. Jedi Knight 2 was a shooter, but its lightsaber combat is still regarded as the best in a Star Wars game to date. The first game I dabbled in was Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, which admittedly ended up more about kicking people into things than sword fighting. During development they realised it was hard to keep track of enemies given their 85-degree field of view, so they designed around this by reducing the number of enemies that can engage the player at once, using squads.
We would group the enemies in group of 4, of squad of 4 maximum, and in this case then 2 of them would be allowed to approach you and they can surround you, we don't care about that, and the 2 others would stay in a distance and taunt you, or they would throw rocks at you, whatever they have in their tools.
They also solved the problem of judging distances by just letting the player get away with misjudging.
The way we did that, we actually had to cheat. What we did, we would just satisfy the intention of the player. We would enlarge the distance and make sure. I mean, at the end, you really had you could hit at like almost 10 feet.
Next Condemned and Xenoclash worked well, but it's perhaps telling that the developers of both series have since moved on to developing zoomed-out brawlers. Series that endure today include 2008's Mount & Blade and the Demon's or Dark Souls series that started in 2009. They both use a behind-your-character perspective that mitigates many of the problems of first-person melee, while still managing to equate you with your character in a way that a more distant side-on view never could. It's an effective halfway point between immersion and gameplay. Dark Souls often breaks this view for giant bosses, but I always enjoyed the smaller fights with human-sized opponents the most. In this view you can see more of the environment and enemies around you than in pure first person. Although you still run into problems with side vision, that's one problem at least partly solved. Newer medieval games have mostly gone back to pure first person, in part because larger monitors and TVs have allowed greatly increased fields of view, which allow you to see much more of your body's limbs, your weapons, and the space around you, even in first person. Chivalry's default field of view is a whopping 105, and competitive players usually play in excess of that. Back to this view though, seeing your character's body also helps with body presence, but this leaves distances still problematic, now especially so because your hands and arms in front of you are obscured by the rest of your body, making it difficult to judge the distance from fist to face. But these games got around it by first elevating the camera and by using long weapons. A solution similar to Dark Messiah's 10-foot sword hits, but with little to no fudging of the numbers. Bigger and longer means easier to see and judge, so it's no surprise that these new combat games have swordplay instead of street fighting. Having longer weapons increases the engagement distance, meaning you can see most of your opponent's body and read their movements, unlike when they're right up in your grill. The second way these games solved the distance problem was by giving the players other options for defense. In Dark Souls, if you can't physically avoid attacks by reading the distance and staying out of range, you can rely on your shield, parries, or the dodge roll's invincibility frames. They depend more on timing than on judging distances. Mount & Blade has a similar reliance on shields or on its revolutionary directional blocking if you're not carrying one, which is secretly the most fun way to play, just make sure to turn off automatic blocking in options. Dark Souls is a more readable game though because of the exaggerated length of the attack animations, as well as the fact that you can't cancel them. Mount & Blade on the other hand can be a confusing mess when looked at by new eyes. The controls are also confusing to new players. While Dark Souls lets you lock on to reduce your dexterity load to just left stick and buttons, Mount & Blade has your left hand on movement and your right hand on mouse performing not double but triple duty. Mouse movement controls your look direction, movement and left mouse controls attack direction, and mouse movement and right mouse controls block direction. This triple duty causes wild camera movements which only add to the confusion. But despite all these drawbacks, it's easily my favourite of the two combat systems. The directional attacks and blocks make me feel like a knight, or at least like the knight I used to imagine being while wielding sticks and sparring with childhood friends. I love Dark Souls, but I'd even argue that while less popular, Mount & Blade's combat is the more influential of the two. At least 4 multiplayer games, Chivalry, War of the Roses, and the yet unreleased For Honor and Mordhau, all feature directional attack and block combat systems. There's also some MMOs and the single-player RPG Kingdom Come Deliverance in development. These two series and the games they inspired got me back into melee fights after years of mostly being characters who look down the barrel of a gun. I'm back poking and prodding at a distance, trying to bait my opponents into a whiffed attack that will leave them vulnerable. These games have started a personal melee combat renaissance, which shows no sign of slowing down.